My name is Valerie Monroe. I'm 61 years old, and until a few hours ago, I was the senior compliance officer at Hadley and Royce Industries, one of the largest manufacturing firms in Portland, Oregon. For nearly 3 decades, I'd been the quiet force behind the scenes, tracking numbers, flagging suspicious transactions, and holding firm when others wanted to cut corners. I had built my reputation on integrity. People knew I wouldn't bend the rules for anyone. Maybe that's what made me a threat. It was Friday afternoon, and something about the air in the office felt off. I had never been called into an executive's office without prior notice, especially not on a Friday, especially not by the director himself, Thomas Brandt. But there I was, sitting stiffly across from him in his polished corner office. He leaned back in his leather chair, his hands folded over a thick manila folder that rested ominously between us. "How long have you been with us, Valerie?" he asked casually, almost too casually. 30 years and 5 days, I replied, my voice steady, though my stomach churned. Thomas gave a slow nod, like he was admiring a piece of art he didn't intend to keep. "That's quite a stretch. But as you know, we're making some hard decisions this quarter. Budget constraints," he said, sliding the folder toward me. My eyes dropped to the label, severance agreement. My pulse quickened, but I said nothing. The company had just posted record profits. The news had come out less than 2 weeks ago, and yet here he was, talking about budget constraints. "Effective immediately," he added, not even pretending to make eye contact. "You'll find everything inside. You have until tomorrow to sign. Saturday. Less than 24 hours. Otherwise, the offer expires." I gave him a quiet nod, stood up, and left without a word. My legs moved on instinct, carrying me through the office that had been my second home for 3 decades. I passed the cubicles I helped design for compliance, the glass meeting rooms where I trained new hires, and the HR office I hadn't visited in years. No goodbyes. Just silence. When I got home, I poured myself a glass of water, sat at the kitchen table, and opened the folder. I flipped through the pages one by one, my jaw tightening with each line. No pension. No continuation of health benefits. Just a one-time payout labeled discretionary compensation, contingent on my waiving all legal rights and agreeing to a confidentiality clause. In plain words, it was hush money. I should have cried. Maybe even screamed. But instead I laughed. A short, sharp breath that left my chest like steam from a pressure valve. They thought I'd take it that I'd go quietly. But what they didn't know, what they could know, was that I had been documenting everything. For 4 years, I had built a digital archive. Every doctored invoice. Every questionable vendor payment. Every email thread where executives gave each other coded instructions to sidestep audits. I hadn't planned to use it. Not unless I had to. Now I had to. I walked over to my study, opened my encrypted drive, and stared at the folder titled H&R Compliance Archive. It was all there, hundreds of files, perfectly organized, time-stamped, and cross-referenced. My hands didn't shake as I reached for my phone. There was only one person I trusted with this. Gregory Santos. He had once been the CFO at Hadley and Royce, until he left, quietly, after what the press called philosophical differences with the board. But I knew better. Gregory had uncovered some of the same things I had, only he didn't have the protection I did. Now he worked for the SEC in Washington, and we hadn't spoken in over 3 years. I found his number and hit call. He picked up on the 3rd ring. "Valerie." There was a pause. I heard the hum of fluorescent lights and muffled voices in the background. "I didn't think I'd hear from you again," he said. "They fired me," I said calmly, 3 days before my pension was set to vest, citing budget constraints. Another pause. Then he whispered, "You kept the files, didn't you?" "Yes," I replied. "And I'm ready to talk." Silence on his end. Then, "I'll call you from a secure line in 10 minutes. Don't sign anything. Don't answer any calls from them. We'll do this the right way." I hung up and sat quietly, staring out the window. The sun was beginning to set, casting golden light across the street outside. 30 years of loyalty, discarded like old paper. But I didn't feel broken. I felt ready. They thought they could end my story with his signature. But they were wrong. I was just getting started. Gregory called back just as he said he would, his voice low and deliberate through a secure line. "We'll bring you in first thing Monday morning," he told me. "You'll meet with the investigators in the Portland SEC office. I'll be there too. Valerie, what you have could be enormous." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "I'll be ready." The moment I ended the call, the rest of my weekend took on a new purpose. I wasn't just an ex-employee anymore. I was a whistleblower. Saturday morning, I pulled every backup drive, every labeled folder, every printed summary I'd compiled over the years. My study became a war room. I worked in silence, the only sound the software of the printer and the occasional hiss of a highlighter as I flagged key timelines and contradictions. I arranged everything into sections: backdated certifications, falsified emissions reports, vendor kickbacks, and ignored compliance memos. Each binder was indexed. Each claim is supported by time-stamped emails, spreadsheets, and scanned documents. The sheer scale of it all even surprised me. I hadn't realized how much I had collected. It was enough to burn the entire executive wing of Hadley and Royce to the ground. By late Saturday afternoon, the phone calls started. First from Human Resources. Then from a block number, Thomas Brandt, no doubt. I didn't answer. They left no voicemails, probably on purpose. Sunday evening, a car I didn't recognize idled near my driveway for nearly 20 minutes before pulling away. I didn't look out the window. I didn't need to. They knew I hadn't signed. And they were scared. I was in the middle of labeling USB drives when I heard the door creak open. "Mom," a soft voice called. It was my daughter, Sophie. She stood in the doorway holding a tray with 2 mugs of tea. Her eyes scanned the papers scattered across my desk. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice quiet. "They fired you?" I nodded. She set the tray down gently. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I didn't want to worry you," I said. "And it's not over yet." She looked at the binders, then at me. "Is this about the fraud you used to hint at?" "Yes. I have everything. I'm going to the SEC tomorrow." Sophie didn't try to stop me. Instead, she walked over, wrapped her arms around me, and whispered, "You taught me to stand up for what's right. Now it's your turn." I smiled. "I'm okay. I've been waiting for this moment longer than you know." We sat for a while in silence, sipping tea and watching the printer spit out the last of the documents. I could feel the weight of my life's work on every page. Monday morning came with cold, gray skies and a soft drizzle, the kind that felt more like mist than rain. I dressed with care: navy blazer, neat slacks, polished shoes. Not to impress, but to feel solid. Grounded. I packed the binders into a rolling suitcase, locked my front door, and drove to the federal building in downtown Portland. The security guard at the entrance took my ID and offered a respectful nod. "They're expecting you, Ms. Monroe. 11th floor." Gregory was already waiting in the lobby outside the SEC conference room. He stood when he saw me, his face lined with seriousness, but something close to pride in his eyes. "You look like someone ready to change the world," he said. "Maybe just clean up a piece of it," I replied. He opened the door, and we stepped into a sleek, glass-walled room. 2 investigators were seated at the far end of the table: Angela Lee, mid-40s, sharp eyes behind rectangular glasses, and James Patel, younger, quiet, with a laptop already open in front of him. "Ms. Monroe," Angela said, rising to shake my hand. "We appreciate you coming in. Gregory's briefed us, but we want to hear everything from you directly." I took a deep breath, wheeled my suitcase to the table, and opened the first binder. "The company has been violating federal compliance laws for at least 4 years," I began. "I've documented repeated patterns of backdated product certifications, fake environmental data reports submitted to regulatory bodies, and internal memos that were intentionally buried or ignored." I laid out the documents one by one. Angela and James didn't interrupt much, only ask precise, clarifying questions. I showed them the discrepancies between supplier payments and services rendered, the signatures on certificates that had been digitally inserted after approval dates, and the executive group chats where they joked about getting around those government watchdogs. Gregory sat quietly, nodding at the key moments, offering context when needed. It wasn't just evidence. It was a timeline, a full map of deception. When I finished, nearly 2 hours later, Angela leaned back and let out a slow breath. "This is incredibly thorough," she said. "And damning." James was already typing notes. "You've laid out multiple serious violations. Fraud, obstruction, falsification of records. These aren't just internal issues, they're federal offenses." Angela looked at me again. "Thank you for your integrity, Ms. Monroe. It takes courage to come forward like this, especially after what they've done to you." I nodded, feeling the weight of the past 72 hours settle into something steadier. "I didn't come here for revenge," I said. "I came here for accountability." "And you've taken the first step," Gregory said gently. As I gathered my things and prepared to leave, something in me felt lighter. Not because I knew how this would end, but because I'd finally chosen not to stay silent. They thought they could silence me with a severance check. But I was never for sale. By the time I reached home that Monday afternoon, I already had 3 missed calls, 2 from Hadley and Royce's legal department, and 1 from Janet in HR. I didn't return any of them. What I didn't know was that the moment I'd walked out of the SEC's conference room, a quiet explosion had gone off inside Hadley and Royce. The SEC wasted no time. Their lawyers contacted the company's legal team before I'd even made it to the parking garage. By noon, panic was spreading like wildfire through the executive floor. The first sign was Janet's voice on my voicemail that evening. Usually peppy and calculated, she now sounded breathless. "Valerie, hi. The board is reviewing everything. There's a lot of activity today. Mr. Brand has been in his office all day, and, well, the directors are requesting a meeting with you.
Please call me back."
They want to talk. I didn't. Instead, I called Barbara. Barbara Reynolds, no relation to me, had been my attorney for over 15 years. Sharp as glass and twice as hard to rattle, she'd handled everything from vendor disputes to my estate planning. When I told her what had happened, she listened without interrupting, then simply said, "We'll go together." The next morning, we walked side by side into the marble lobby of Hadley and Royce. I hadn't stepped foot inside since the day they fired me. The receptionist's face froze the moment she saw me. I smiled politely, her unease satisfying in a quiet, private way. Barbara announced to us firmly, "Valerie Monroe and her legal counsel. We're expected." We were shown to the same boardroom where, years ago, I had once given quarterly compliance briefings that no one listened to. Today, it was full. The entire board sat around the gleaming oak table, their faces tight with nerves. Thomas Brandt was there too, but noticeably silent, eyes downcast, a man who had miscalculated badly. "Ms. Monroe," began Meredith Caldwell, the chair of the board, her tone surprisingly gentle. "Thank you for coming. We're here to formally address the events of last week." I nodded but said nothing. Barbara gave her a short, tight smile. "We have reviewed the circumstances of your termination," Meredith continued, "and we regret to say it was mishandled. Effective immediately, your termination is rescinded. Your pension will be reinstated in full." "And the severance agreement?" Barbara asked calmly. "Nullified," Meredith said quickly. "It should never have been issued with such urgency." Barbara nodded. "And the offer on the table?" Meredith straightened her papers. "We'd like to offer Ms. Monroe a senior consulting position. Flexible hours, full benefits, and discretion over which department she advises." I folded my hands in my lap. "I appreciate the offer," I said evenly. "But I didn't come back here for a job." A quiet ripple of tension passed through the room. "I came because for years I sent reports. I flagged discrepancies. I sent emails that were never answered. I spoke up when the numbers didn't match. And not once, not once, not once, not once was I taken seriously." No one interrupted. Even Brandt remained stone silent. I was treated like a nuisance. And then, 3 days before my pension vested, I was discarded like trash. "Ms. Monroe," Meredith began, "I'm not interested in apologies," I said. "What happens next depends entirely on your actions, not your words." Barbara slid a folder across the table. We'll require written confirmation of the pension reinstatement and nullification of the prior agreement. You'll also send us documentation confirming Ms. Monroe's employment file has been restored with no termination mark. Of course, Meredith replied quickly. And the consulting role? Asked one of the younger board members. I looked him directly in the eye. I'll think about it. The meeting ended with tight handshakes and forced smiles. As we left the room, I glanced once at Thomas Brandt. He didn't meet my eyes. Barbara and I walked out of the building, the morning sun breaking through the clouds overhead. I took a deep breath. Well, she said, unlocking the car. That was satisfying. They're scared, I said. They should be. She smirked. You're not going to let this go, are you? No, I said. But I'm going to let them wonder what comes next. Because the truth was, it wasn't just about my pension or my job or even the files I handed over to the SEC. It was about the message. They'd spent years pretending the rules didn't apply to them. Now they were beginning to learn just how wrong they were. I hadn't expected it to move so fast. By Thursday morning, headlines were already swirling across the internet. SEC launches formal investigation into Hadley and Royce financial misconduct. I sat at my kitchen table, coffee in hand, watching it all unfold on my tablet. The news outlets were quoting unnamed federal sources, citing internal whistleblower documents and mounting evidence of regulatory violations. The company's stock took a nosedive before noon. Over 20% was wiped out in hours. By the afternoon, I started receiving texts from former colleagues, some supportive, some stunned, a few apologetic. I ignored most of them. And then, around dinner time, I saw it. A polished segment on one of the business channels. Thomas Brandt, in a navy suit and crisp white shirt, was sitting across from a news anchor, lips pulled into the same thin smile he'd worn when he fired me. I can't speak about pending investigations, he said, pausing just long enough to sound pained, but I will say that Ms. Monroe's departure was a routine internal matter. While we appreciate her many years of service, we're disappointed by the narrative being painted by someone with a grudge. My fingers tightened around the coffee mug. I can't comment on every file that crossed her desk, he continued smoothly, but we have yet to see any credible evidence that supports her claims. It was subtle, controlled, a PR move, but it was a challenge all the same. I let the video play to the end. Then I stood up, walked to the hallway closet, and retrieved a small, fireproof box. Inside was a single key. The next morning, I drove across town to the credit union. The woman at the front desk recognized me immediately. Here to access your safe deposit box, Ms. Monroe? Yes, I said. In the privacy room, I opened the drawer and pulled out a thick, sealed envelope. It had my handwriting across the front. In case of silence, break with noise. Inside were printed email exchanges and original documents that went back almost a decade, long before Thomas Brandt's arrival. The fraud didn't start with him. It started years earlier, under different leadership, and it had simply evolved. These records had never been stored on company servers. They were my own insurance policy. Originals. Untouched. Untampered. I scanned them into a secure folder and sent them directly to Gregory, flagged as urgent. Within 2 hours, he called. Valerie, this changes everything. I thought it might, I replied calmly. These emails predate Brandt's time. They implicated at least 3 sitting board members. This isn't just financial fraud, it's systemic cover-up. We're escalating this. I thanked him and hung up. That evening, Brandt's interview began making the rounds online, but this time, something had shifted. Alongside clips of his smooth denials were screenshots of heavily redacted emails, leaked excerpts that matched the files I had just released through proper legal channels. Whispers turned to outrage. His PR campaign began to backfire. By Friday morning, the SEC issued a rare public statement. We have reviewed materials submitted in cooperation with our investigation into Hadley and Royce Industries. The whistleblower has demonstrated consistent credibility and provided substantial documentation that is central to our findings. That one sentence changed everything. The calls started coming again, but this time they weren't from HR. They were journalists, podcasters, news anchors, and legal analysts. They wanted interviews, exclusive features, primetime specials. I declined them all. I didn't want to be the face on the evening news or the woman whose voice echoed through headlines. That had never been the goal. I just wanted the truth to matter more than the cover-up. Over the next week, the fallout inside the company was swift and brutal. 3 board members announced their early retirement by Monday. By Wednesday, a 4th quietly resigned. Thomas Brandt hadn't been seen publicly since his interview. Rumors swirled that he'd been placed on indefinite leave. Through it all, I remained quiet. No press statements. No interviews. No viral social media posts. People kept telling me I should speak out, tell my story, take back the narrative. But I didn't need to. The truth was louder than any microphone. I spent my mornings walking along the river trail near my house, listening to birds and watching the water move. Peaceful, unbothered. And when I returned, I'd check in with Gregory, who updated me on the ongoing investigation with meticulous professionalism. One morning, as we wrapped up a call, he paused. "You know, Valerie," he said, "most people in your position would have wanted revenge." I smiled. I didn't do this for revenge. I did it because I couldn't look the other way anymore. "Still," he said, "you've changed the game for everyone who comes after you." Maybe that was true. Maybe that was enough. Because as the house of cards crumbled and the dust began to settle, one thing became clear. They had bet everything on my silence and lost. The news came on a quiet Tuesday morning. David Brandt, along with 2 former board members of Hadley and Royce, had officially pleaded guilty in federal court. Wire fraud, obstruction, conspiracy. The courtroom was packed with reporters, but I wasn't there. I didn't need to be. I had already lived every page of that story. The real justice came not from watching their downfall, but from knowing it had finally arrived. When the sentencing was over, Gregory called me. 3 years for Brandt. 5 for each board member. Fines, asset seizures, and permanent disqualification from serving on any public board. I exhaled slowly. "It's done, then." "Not quite," he said. "The consulting role is still on the table. Full autonomy. You'd answer only to the board." "I appreciate it," I said gently, "but I'm not going back." And I meant it. Instead, I chose a different path. One that would have made my husband, Thomas, proud. He passed 6 years ago, long before any of this began, but I felt his quiet wisdom in every choice I made. He was the one who always reminded me that ethics weren't just about rules, they were about people. So when the SEC offered me a role on their internal reform team, helping improve whistleblower protection protocols and internal auditing standards, I accepted. Not out of ambition, out of purpose. It felt right to use what I'd learned not just to punish, but to protect. 2 months later, the whistleblower compensation came through. 15% of the financial penalties recovered from Hadley and Royce and its leadership. The sum was more than I'd ever expected. Add that to my fully reinstated pension and the compensation agreement, and suddenly, my retirement looked very different from what I had imagined. But I didn't need much. The first thing I did was open a trust in Thomas's name. The Thomas Monroe Scholarship for Women in Corporate Ethics now offers full-ride scholarships to young women pursuing degrees in business compliance, auditing, and regulatory law. Every time I reviewed an application, I saw the fire in those girls' eyes, the same fire that once burned in me. Sophie and her kids moved closer shortly after that. They'd always talked about finding a quieter pace of life, and when I bought a small cottage near Crescent Lake, it gave them the excuse they needed. Now, weekends were filled with laughter, canoe rides, and backyard dinners under string lights. It was peaceful, honest, simple. Sometimes, I'd sit on the porch with a cup of tea and watch the sun slip behind the trees. There were still days when the past tugged at me, memories of boardroom fights, ignored warnings, the quiet heartbreak of being cast aside. But they didn't sting like they used to. I didn't regret my time at Hadley and Royce. For all its corruption and failure, I had built something real there. I had stood for something when it mattered. What I did regret was that the system had failed before I ever did. It had allowed people like Brandt to rise unchecked. It had rewarded silence and punished truth. And it had nearly cost me everything I'd worked for. But it didn't win. One chilly October morning, I received a thick envelope in the mail, Hadley and Royce's new annual report. Glossy.
Polished. Different.
I skimmed through the contents, noting the newly formed ethics committee, the reshaped executive structure, and the detailed compliance metrics listed in bold. My name wasn't anywhere in the report. It didn't need to be. The changes spoke louder. I closed the report and rested my hand on its cover. A quiet pride bloomed in my chest, not because they had fallen, but because the truth had finally stood taller than the lies. That's what mattered in the end. Not revenge. No recognition. Just integrity, echoing long after the noise had faded.